Καλησπέρα σε όλους σας. Σας καλωσορίζω εκ μέρους του ΣΕΚΑΣΕ στο σημερινό μας workshop με θέμα τις οικονομικές κυρώσεις. Σας ευχαριστούμε που μας τιμάτε με την παρουσία σας και ελπίζουμε να βρείτε ενδιαφέροντα τα όσα θα ακουστούν. Θα είναι χαρά μας να συνεχίζετε να στηρίζετε τις εκδηλώσεις μας και να μας βρίσκετε χρήσιμους. Θερμές ευχαριστίες και στη νομική βιβλιοθήκη για τη φιλοξενία της, αλλά και στη Moody's για τη χορηγία του catering της σημερινής εκδήλωσης. Dear guests for Moody's, we are happy to have you with us today. We want to thank for our cooperation and also the sponsoring of the catering of this event. Θα καλέσω τώρα στο βήμα τον πρόεδρο του συνδέσμου μας, τον κύριο Μισελ Μοντεμπράν, για την εισαγωγική του ομιλία. Μισελ, το λόγο σε εσένα.
Καλησπέρα σας, αγαπητοί προσκεκλημένοι, αγαπητοί συνάδελφοι. Καλώς ήρθατε στο Decoding Economic Sanctions Workshop του ΣΕΚΑΣΕ. Όπως έχετε ενημερωθεί και στο παρελθόν, ο ΣΕΚΑΣΕ έχει αναπτύξει ένα αναλυτικό πλάνο εκπαιδεύσεων και ημερίδων από το τέταρτο τρίμηνο του 2022 και για όλο το έτος 2023. Μέχρι σήμερα, ο ΣΕΚΑΣΕ έχει υλοποιήσει με συνέπεια το εν λόγω πρόγραμμα και το σημερινό workshop εντάσσεται και αυτό στα πλαίσια της δέσμευσής μας για διαρκή ενημέρωση. Ο ΣΕΚΑΣΕ εργάζεται σκληρά ώστε και μετά το καλοκαίρι να ολοκληρωθούν και άλλα workshops, όπως σε θέματα ESG και καταπολέμηση του ξεπλήματος, και συνέδρια όπως το γνωστό μας συνέδριο, το Compliance Conference, που αναμένεται να ολοκληρωθεί το Νοέμβριο σε συνεργασία με τη νομική βιβλιοθήκη. Θα έχετε ενημερωθεί επίσης πως τα βραβεία κανονιστικής συμμόρφωσης είναι πλέον γεγονός και πως έχει ξεκινήσει η διαδικασία για την υποβολή υποψηφιωτήτων. Είμαστε χαρούμενοι που καταφέραμε να ολοκληρώσουμε και αυτό το στόχο τόσο γρήγορα. Σε ό,τι αφορά το σημερινό workshop, είναι μια πρωτοβουλία του ΣΕΚΑΣΕ ώστε τα μέλη του συνδέσμου να λάβουν επίκαιρες πληροφορίες για ένα τόσο σημαντικό θέμα. Όπως γνωρίζετε, οι οικονομικές κυρώσεις αποτελούν ένα μέσο που μπορεί να χρησιμοποιηθεί για την επίτευξη διάφορων στόχων, όπως είναι η προάσπιση εθνικών συμφερόντων και η προώθηση της παγκόσμιας ασφάλειας και σταθερότητας. Το έχουμε δει πολύ πρόσφατα στον πόλεμο της Ρωσίας κατά της Ουκρανίας, όπου επιβλήθηκαν πολύ σημαντικές κυρώσεις στη Ρωσία, κυρίως από δυτικά κράτη. Οι οικονομικές κυρώσεις είναι ένα πολύ σημαντικό θέμα για τις εταιρείες, καθώς μπορούν να έχουν επιπτώσεις στην επιχειρηματική τους λειτουργία, στην οικονομική τους απόδοση και σε θέματα κανονιστικής συμμόρφωσης. Ως εκ τούτου είναι πολύ σημαντικό οι εταιρείες να γνωρίζουν ποιες κυρώσεις ισχύουν. Θα πρέπει να διενεργήσουν τη σχετική αξιολόγηση κινδύνου και να έχουν μηχανισμό εντοπισμού, παρακολούθησης και έγκρισης, καθώς η μη συμμόρφωση με το συγκεκριμένο πλαίσιο μπορεί να οδηγήσει σε πολύ σημαντικά νομικά προβλήματα, σε υψηλά πρόστιμα και σε απώλεια φήμης. Η ατζέντα του σημερινού workshop περιλαμβάνει μια ενδελεχή ανάλυση του θέματος με πρακτικά παραδείγματα και καλές πρακτικές. Είναι πολύ σημαντικό οι εταιρείες να γνωρίζουν τις υποχρεώσεις τους από αυτό το πλαίσιο και να έχουν τη τεχνογνωσία να εκπληρώσουν τις υποχρεώσεις τους με το καλύτερο δυνατό τρόπο. Θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω τον κύριο Σοφοκλή Καραπηδάκη, την κυρία Ζέφη Νικολάου και τον κύριο Δημήτρη Μπιζάνο, που από πλευρά ΣΕΚΑΣΕ εργάστηκαν σκληρά για να ολοκληρωθεί το σημερινό workshop. Ένα μεγάλο ευχαριστώ στη νομική βιβλιοθήκη, που είναι σταθερός και στενός συνεργάτης του ΣΕΚΑΣΕ, που στηρίζει το ΣΕΚΑΣΕ με όλους τους δυνατούς τρόπους και που σήμερα μας φιλοξενεί σε μια τόσο όμορφη αίθουσα. Να πούμε επίσης ένα μεγάλο ευχαριστώ στους ανθρώπους της Moody's που ταξιδέψαν από το εξωτερικό για να μας στηρίξουν στη προσπάθειά μας. Το ίδιο και για τους ανθρώπους της Transcrime. Και τέλος ένα μεγάλο ευχαριστώ στην ομάδα εργασίας του Συνδέσμου, στην ομάδα εργασίας για την καταπολέμηση του ξεπλήματος, που βοήθησε στη προετοιμασία αυτού του workshop και που συμμετέχει και σήμερα σε διάφορες παρουσιάσεις. Αυτά ήθελα να σας πω εκ μέρους του Διοικητικού Συμβουλίου της ΕΚΑΣΕ. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ που είσαστε εδώ μαζί μας σήμερα. Ευχόμαστε να μείνετε ευχαριστημένοι από το σημερινό workshop και πιστεύω πως μπορούμε να ξεκινήσουμε με την πρώτη ενότητα που, αν δεν κάνω λάθος, αφορά το Sanction Landscape, που θα παρουσιάσει ο Νίκολα Πασαριέλο, διευθυντικός τέλεχος της Moody's. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ.
Καλώς ήρθατε. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I would like to express my gratitude to Sophocles, Eleni, Eskase, ASCO I call in English, as well as its dedicated staff. I would also like to extend a special thank you to Moody's Analytics for its valuable support in making this workshop possible. I will provide you with an overview of the sanctions landscape, as you can read in the title, a topic that would typically require 2 full days to cover comprehensively. Now, just about me very quickly, I have almost 30 years of professional experience, and I had the privilege of working in both the private and public sectors. Notably, I served as a member of the AMF, Autorité des marchés financiers, the French market regulator. Additionally, I hold the position as a board member of the ECAMS Association in Italy, and I have obtained a postgraduate qualification in financial crime prevention from the International Compliance Association, which I believe is your partner. Now, there are 5 modules in my presentation. A bit of history, it's always good. We often talk about sanctions as an instrumental tool for national security and foreign policy. And a striking historical example can be found in your ancient land. During the Peloponnesian War, the Athenian statesman and General Pericles implemented the Megarian Decree, which included a series of sanctions to economically isolate the city-state of Megara, an ally of Sparta, by limiting its trade and commercial activities. I'm sure you're familiar with it. There appears to be little novelty in the current situation regarding the sanctions imposed on Russia and Belarus in response to the invasion of Ukraine. Sanctions, and this is probably require a bit of attention from your side. Sanctions can take different shapes and forms. Let's start with comprehensive sanctions, the one you see on the left-hand side, also known as embargoes. Generally, they prohibit all types of trades with a specific country or region, such as the controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine and Crimea following the illegal annexation. Targeted sanctions or smart sanctions, you can use equally both words, on the other hand, target specific industries such as defense, energy, financial services within the country, but not the entire country. Now, primary and secondary sanctions, as you can see there, in the case of the US, I will talk about Europe and the UK afterwards. Primary sanctions apply to a US person. What does it mean? A US person is a US citizen, a US person with a US nationality, or a US registered company. But US primary sanctions also extend to situations involving a US nexus. For example, you are a Greek national, a Greek person, or a Greek company, but you transact in US dollars, for example, or trade in US originating goods and services. Think typically software, US software embedded in the product you are dealing with. In that case, the US primary sanctions will apply to you. Now, secondary sanctions is the ultimate level, in the sense that they aim to discourage any non-US person, again, a Greek person, it could be Italian, German, from engaging in transactions with sanctioned individuals and entities by the OFAC, even if there is no US nexus whatsoever. The negative impact of secondary sanctions in case you breach them might include the denial of export license to the US or even a ban from US financial system. The Europeans have introduced the blocking statute, probably we're going to talk about it later, as a defense mechanism in response to secondary sanctions to protect the EU companies from the extraterritoriality of the US law, like in the case of Iran. However, the effectiveness of this measure remain a topic of debate. Now, you also see thematic is probably the most interesting sanctions type, as opposed to the traditional way of enforcing sanctions on countries. A thematic approach usually designate offenders based on a specific category, could be human trafficking, cybercrime, etc. The impact of sanctions typically results in an asset freeze and seizure, prohibition on providing funds. You have also travel bans. This is called diplomatic sanctions, and trading in specific goods, services, and technology. Now, from this graph, you can see it clearly describes the sharp rise of sanctions against Russia since the invasion of Ukraine. The prevailing question on everyone's mind is whether sanctions will be lifted once the war concludes. The answer is likely to be no. Be prepared for a world where sanctions persist. They will stay around, with the emergence of new sanctions regimes in the future, contingent upon geopolitical tensions, for example, against China. Now, when addressing the topic of sanctions, it is crucial not only to interpret the relevant regulations as you receive them from, for instance, the EU, but also, and this is a recommendation, to consult the guidance provided by various regulators. Now, if you go to the European Commission's dedicated page on the Ukrainian war, you will find the FAQ section, very interesting. Typical situation, you are an insurance company, and you know that the EU prohibits the provision of financial assistance for the sale or export of dual-use goods and technology, unless authorized by national competent authorities. Now, who should request the authorization? The exporter, the insurer, or both? The FAQ section in the EU website states very clearly that the authorization should be requested by the insurer after consulting the exporter. This is the EU 11 sanction package to combat sanctions evasion through certain third countries, notably in Central Asia, aiming to close loopholes that have allowed banned products to leak into Russia. This tool enables the EU to restrict the sale or export of sanctioned goods and technology to those high-risk third countries. Now, the 11 package includes also additional listing, prohibition on selling intellectual property rights connected to restricted goods, and limitation on access to EU ports for vessels suspected of breaching the Russian oil price cap. There are concerns, and this is going to be a topic that we'll develop later, also with the latest intervention from Transcrime, is the Russians' shadow tanker fleet, which operates outside of Western service providers, typically European insurance company, and sells oil above the price cap to countries like India and China. Now, investigative journalists have reported approximately 600 vessels engaging in ship-to-ship oil transfers in the Mediterranean near, for example, Ceuta, which is the Spanish outpost in Morocco. And these follow tactics used by Iran and Venezuela. Now, if you can see here, what are the main aspects? Is the European Commission is proposing to include sanction breaches, so the violation of EU economic restrictions, as a criminal offense. And this has major impact. It was not the case in the past. Talking about guidance, and I know that the time slot I have is so limited that I'm trying to go as fast as possible. But of course, if there are questions, we can address them later on. Similarly, in the US, we have authorities that have joined forces, FinCEN, OFAC, the Department of Justice, the US State Department, and Department of Commerce, to provide comprehensive guidance on sanction-related matters, on how to conduct due diligence on customers and third parties intermediaries. We will discuss about this later. And not limit just to the physical location of your clients and intermediaries, but also the digital footprint. It's very important to include factors such as the IP addresses, geolocation, email addresses. OFAC provides a framework with 5 key components for a robust sanctions compliance program. Following these guidelines can be considered a mitigating factor. This is extremely important. That means that somehow is your best defense strategy in case things go wrong. Top management support is the first one. It's quite intuitive and self-explanatory, even though middle management plays a crucial role. Risk assessment. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. We know that. A comprehensive risk assessment should evaluate every touch point with the outside world. Again, not just customers, supply chain, intermediaries, counterparties, internal controls, policies and procedure. Now, the last one actually, before the training, testing and audit. This is extremely important. Organizations should enhance their program based on identified compliance gaps, including updating elements to adapt to changing risk environments. If you remember, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the shift from physical to remote client relationships required a recalibration in compliance processes. Traditionally, distant client relationships were seen as a very high risk. And of course, all of a sudden, they received all these red flag alerts designed for physical settings which were no longer suitable. Training. Training is not just for employees. It's also for stakeholders, clients, suppliers, business partners. Now, we're going to talk about probably the most interesting part is this module 2, sanction, ownership, and control. Again, a bit of attention. I will develop the concept of ownership, which is based on a mathematical approach. Computation is pure computation, from control and influence, which are more subject to interpretation, they're more nuanced, and therefore to errors. And we will see these ownership, control, and influence across the 3 main jurisdictions when it comes to sanctions, US, UK, and the EU. For the US, if an entity is at least 50%, meaning 50% or more, owned by sanctioned person, it is considered sanction as well, and you know that. This means that even if the entity is not listed on the OFAC, its property and interest are still blocked. How do you compute the 50%? That's a question, and a tricky one. The calculation of the 50% ownership can be based on individual or aggregate ownership, whether held directly or indirectly. Let's see a practical example, otherwise we get lost. Consider this scenario. You have a legal person, A, with a red flag, sanction, listed, is on the list, and an individual, I, designated, listed on the OFAC list, okay, both sanctioned. Now, according to OFAC's 50% rule, entities B, C, D, and E under A, they're all of these directly or indirectly owned more than 50% by A, and therefore they should be considered blocked. Now, also F is blocked because it's the result of an aggregation of A plus I. If this is becoming clear, let's see now a little bit a step further. Specifically on aggregation, it only applies to the US and the EU sanctions regime, not to the UK. So you do the aggregation US, EU, but not the UK. And this is the simple part. Now, just to make a little bit the exercise a bit more complicated, so what you can aggregate? You can aggregate two SDNs, so two entities that are both listed on the SDN, regardless of the type of regime. One could be under the Iranian regime, the other from under the Ukrainian regime. You can adapt. You can aggregate two SSIs, sectoral sanction identification. You cannot aggregate one SDN and one SSI or two SSI from different directives. A bit complicated, but just to make things clear, US can aggregate, EU aggregates, they add up, okay? Only entities under Russian sanctions for the EU. And UK, there are exceptions, but we're not going to talk about the exceptions now. So what are the other differences between the US, Europe, and UK sanctions regime? Europe and UK, in the computation, they consider majority ownership, which means more than 50%. US is at least 50%. Again, do you have the tool to be able to detect these nuances? And also, Europe and UK talk about control. Control does not apply to the US sanctions regime, only ownership. Now, what does control mean? Control includes the ability to appoint or remove the majority of the board members, a shareholder agreement, an informal coalition between family members, and also there are many scenarios, but also, for instance, the right to use all or part of the entity's assets. Now, hopefully, this is not becoming too complex, but let's take a very concrete examples. What is the 50% rule based on ownership, on computation? So we're not talking about control, ownership. Here we have 3 Russian individuals placed under sanctions were connected to 2 banks, and those banks were in turn connected to 42 sanction-linked entities named on the list, okay? However, we were able to uncover 94 additional entities which are not named on the sanction list, but have to be considered blocked, as from my previous explanation. This is a very concrete example. VEB is the Russian state-owned bank sanctioned by the EU and the US. While VEB and 25 of its subsidiaries were designated on the OFAC, we identified more than 200 entities more that with the blue flag, unfortunately you cannot map all of them, own 50% or more by VEB, and therefore they have to be considered sanctioned as well. Now, what is the nexus with the, I hope I didn't lose you because I'm really going very fast and it's clear. I know it's, doing this in 40 minutes, something that usually we do in 2 days. I'm not kidding. It's a challenge, but hopefully something will stay with you. Now, what is important here? OFAC traditionally has focused on financial institutions, typically banks, right? Now what we see is that OFAC is shifting the focus towards non-financial companies, corporates, in order to disrupt supply chain networks as a form of sanctions evasion. Corporates are using suppliers to evade, to circumvent sanctions. So here we have a company based in Moscow, Russia, Cernia Engineering, that plays a central role in operating a supply chain network under the direction of the Russian intelligence services. This network is engaged in a lawful acquisition of critical technology, microchips, machine tools, dual-use equipments. Let's see concretely what does it look like. Sorry, it's on the right. Here you have on top the Russian intelligence agency FSB that, as I say, they need to acquire technology, ammunition, and other things to keep, the Russian army operating. And they set up a company, Cernia, as you see just below FSB, But also they needed to set up additional companies in the UK in order to achieve their objective. Now, for example, you see two UK companies there, sorry, probably it's a bit small, Majori LLP and Photon Pro LLP. They were both sanctioned for their involvement in the sanctions evasion scheme. Now, and let's go in the practical example, how we solve the issue of computation for the ownership, the 50% rule, especially for complex cases like circular ownership. We use a powerful algorithm called T-rank. Let's see what does it mean. Now, circular ownership makes it hard to determine who owns a given company. Suppose there are three companies with a cross-ownership, and the red company in the middle called Manser Telecom, I don't know if you can read the one in red, with a self-integrated ownership of 87.50% measured by this algorithm, which is the result of the cross-ownership. There are companies owning each other. The result of this computation, is that Manser owns of itself 87.50. Now, if you look at the two shareholders above, Maria Gonzalez and Jesus Juarez, each owns directly 6.25 into Manser Telecom. Therefore, you might assume they are not in control, nor they can be considered beneficial owners. But technically, this 87.50, the self-integrated ownership, need to be redistributed pro rata to Maria and Jesus. And therefore, their total ownership into Manser is not 6.25, is up to 50%. So they're beneficial owners, they're in control. You see, it's very complicated. How we solve the issue of control? I mentioned computation for the ownership. Now we talk about control. Remember, control applies to the EU, UK, doesn't apply to the US, even though, and I want to make this very complex, the US says, be careful when it's below 50%, because whoever is trying to evade sanctions, he may decrease his ownership to 49.9%. How do you treat that? You need to identify, screen it, and monitor over time, even for the US. But let's stick to the EU and UK. How we solve the problem of control? Again, here we have a theoretical example on the left side. You might exclude the shareholder A. You see you have three shareholders, A, B, and C. You might exclude the shareholder A from your screening process because he only owns 2%, whereas B and C each own 49% into the target company. However, if you consider, and this is a form of control, all the possible voting combinations to influence the corporate governance of the target company, you realize that the three shareholders have exactly, you see the voting combination, how they can vote, no, yes, 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 no, no. They have exactly the same voting combination, equal at 50%. Therefore, A has the same voting power than B and C, and it should not be excluded from the screening process. Concrete example. Here we have a company, well, an individual, Yuan, has a 4% direct ownership into a company called Turm Garage. Now, let's see, 4% is really minimal, we can say. Now, Yuan is the smallest owner, right? Now, if you think in terms of possible voting combination, this is something that the algorithm calculates very quickly. You don't need paper and a pencil and do by yourself. You also might make mistakes. That's very easy. You realize that he's probably the most powerful shareholder because he has a voting power or shareholder power at 75%, if you can read that and trust us. Now, another form of control, and I'm talking about, again, control, just I repeat myself but to make sure that I can convey the message. I'm not talking about ownership, I'm talking about control. De facto control. On this slide, you noted that Mr. Mamontov, I don't know if you can read this, it should be big enough. I cannot read very well, I try to read here. But Mr. Mamontov indirectly, you have to measure the direct stake at each level, indirectly owns 21.42% of the subject company in red. However, Mamontov has control, de facto control. Why? Because the other shareholdings are widely dispersed. If there are many shareholders at 1%, 0 point something, is the one that owns 21 that controls. Trade sanctions. In order to address, big audience in terms of diversity, financial institutions, insurance companies, we mentioned. Now I'm talking about a little bit more of the corporate sector. Trade sanctions are embargoes on specific goods, technologies. We mentioned microchips or commodities like oil. We know the oil price cap. When we talk about export control, you hear a lot about export control, is a subset of trade sanctions. Trade sanctions is the wider category. Export control specifically deals with the regulation of sensitive technology, microchips and dual-use goods. Now, there are also stringent control around the military and use list. We capture all this information, as you can see on the list on the right-hand side. We capture depending on all the authorities that are issuing that. Now, this is an example, very concrete example. We refer to the source, BIS, the Bureau of Industry and Security, issued by the Commerce Department, which identifies a Chinese denied entity that is subject to license requirements in case of export. Here, this is another example. As you know, the human trafficking issue, the importation of goods from the Xinjiang region in China. I'm not spending a lot of time, but this is also very important. General licenses, when it comes to sanctions, in addition to specific licenses that you have to request to the national authorities, I'm sure you're very familiar with it, general licenses, we capture them because this is what we call a shield from sanctions, exempting the need for specific license requests. When you supply typically essential goods or for humanitarian purposes. Very important slide. In February 2022, the US introduced export controls aimed at Russian defense, with an extension to include China as well, in order to slow down their military program. Our systems, because the thing is to capture information, but also to predict suspicious patterns. That's really the key, to anticipate something that will go wrong afterwards. So through our systems, we were able to identify an increasing risk related to the smuggling of sensitive technology from the US and Europe into Russia through that same period. You see the bubbles are getting bigger, which anticipated sanctions evasion tactics. And this is a very good example here. You have this company, STEC. You see this is registered. Can you see well? Yes. Okay. STEC, which is registered in an apartment in Moscow. STEC imports microchips from Kazakhstan. And then from Kazakhstan, the company in Kazakhstan, I cannot even read myself, I would have to use, but it's right above. Yeah. Then from Kazakhstan, imports is the third country circumventing sanctions, imports from Germany. And essentially, Germany imports from companies, buy from companies like STM Microelectronics, Infineon, etc. Now, the funny thing is the company in Germany and in Kazakhstan is owned by the same person, by the same family. So this is clearly a risky transaction. Now, we will talk heavily about ship-to-ship transfer. This is a technique used to evade sanctions. But one thing we captured through the Lloyd's list intelligence is that, for instance, in Slovenia, there was a 350% increase in Russian ship arrivals right after the invasion of Ukraine. And we know that Slovenia is an entry point of Russian goods into Europe. Now, tracking vessels, ownership structures, and we will talk about this with transcribe and sanction vessels, is a very important topic you should be aware of. Identifying all the vessels that might use this technique. We were able to identify even the path, how the ship-to-ship transfer operates. You got two vessels, the red one vessel getting close to the vessel elephant, the yellow one, and they do a first ship-to-ship transfer. The red one is sanctioned, and this happened as, I think it was near Ceuta, the outpost in Morocco. And then the vessel elephant finally transferred to a vessel Maersk that the captain, I think, got arrested once they docked in Spain. Now, I mentioned already the importance of doing, when you do sanction screening, to look not just at the physical aspect, the address, the nationality of the individual, the age, all of this, but also to look at the digital footprint. It's very important. More and more IP geolocation, domain server, email address. Now, we're smoothly going towards the end. These are typically the techniques employed for evading sanctions. And you need to calibrate. We said one of the components of the ONFAC sanctions compliance program is to recalibrate your program in order to respond to new risk, emerging trends. Now, there are different techniques used for evading sanctions. I will not explore all of them in details, but a few of them probably is worth exploring. Ownership transfer to relatives and friends. And this is a very good example. The first one is about sanctioned oligarch Timchenko, a red flag individual, as you can see. He transferred 100% of his ownership in a company to his father-in-law into the company Prim Crab. Now, if you're not aware of the family connection between Timchenko and his father-in-law, you will not notice this high risk. And the second one is Michael Friedman, another sanctioned oligarch, that transferred his ownership to his young personal assistant a few days after the invasion of Ukraine. Of course, I'm going to skip this, mindful of time. Shell companies is another problem, another issue that you should be aware of. We have developed a tool that detects the shell companies, which can be potentially exploited for illicit activities. Based on the findings of the SOCTA, which is the Serious and Organized Crime Threat Assessment by Europol, reveals that 80% of the legal entities, 80%, I repeat, of legal entities abused by criminals are legally entities, legally registered. Very difficult. So shell companies are perfectly legal. The problem is that their main feature of opacity makes them ideal for money laundering, sanctions evasion, and other financial crimes. Now, coming to a conclusion, and this is last slide I'm going to comment. What this slide is conveying here, and I think it's really summarized pretty well, is the need to shift, when it comes to sanctions compliance, to shift away from the linear screening approach, meaning checking one name against one or multiple sanctions list, to the graph you see down there, meaning the world has become too complex. And criminals operate in an hybrid manner, meaning they're not isolated. They establish connections with risky jurisdictions, corrupt political exposed persons, they exploit emerging technologies like dark web, and they engage in activities such as counterfeiting, smuggling, and money laundering. So to enhance the efficiency of your program, reducing false positives, and effectiveness by increasing true positives. So you go one hand, reduce my false positives because they create a lot of noise. On the other hand, I have to really be effective and identify my true positive. Digitalization, and we will see this with my colleague, is one of the answers, is very important. Moving to a perpetual KYC, that's also important, which involves continuous monitoring and updating your counterparty's KYC profile. The traditional practice of updating customer information every 5 years is not adequate in the current geopolitical context. And perform these network analysis, as you see, proxies, IP address, relatives, ownership, and ultimate beneficial ownership. Last point, that we created a tool for that to identify the sanctions 360 degrees. Last point, of course, this is still not enough. The last point, and that's what we see in many countries in Europe, where I'm the privilege to go and speak to different audiences, you see more and more partnerships between private to private and private to public. Of course, that implies a data privacy kind of arrangement framework in order to share information, but that's probably what is going to help us to combat financial crime. Many thanks.
We thank Nicola very much for the excellent elaboration on the applicable, on the sanction regimes, which we need to consider when doing our exercise. I will highlight that this exercise to be sanction compliant is rather difficult because, as you've heard by Nicola, the lists are not complete. They contain only some special designated nationals, if we talk about OFAC, or some designated entities, if we talk about European Union, and the rest of the exercise is something that we need to do. You heard about the 50% ownership, about the controlling. It's rather complicated, I would say. But let's see now what companies can do on these matters, on the sanction matters. Banks and financial institutions and insurance companies had the luck to onboard longer before corporates, before industrial companies into that matter. And they have had a lot of fines received. And now I would say they know their way around. But what is in for the other companies, for the other corporates, which this matter is rather new for them? And as we heard before by Nicola, OFAC, he said OFAC is shifting now from financial institutions his attention to the corporates. Why? Because he wants to tackle the supply chain. One statement is that some time ago, companies were sure that if a transaction would breach sanctions, banks would catch it. But the statement is that if it arrives to the bank for payment, then it's very late. The program, the product or the service is already shipped, provided or received or anything. So sanctions have been already violated. So on the first slide, I've prepared only 2 slides. So how companies should tackle the matter? First of all, they need to name somebody who will take the lead. They can name it sanctions compliance officer or something else, but he needs to have exclusively the responsibility to know, study, and respond to that matter. The second one is to perform a risk assessment. Why? Risk assessment contains what are the products that we sell, where we buy from, what are the services we provide, what is the know-how, even know-how provision to a third party to show him how to do things is sanctioned sometimes. Software can be sanctioned. Which countries we sell to, what is the final destination that our products would go, what is the end customer. And from this exercise, a rather complicated exercise based on the concepts that Nicola presented before, it would derive which sanctions regimes are applicable to the organization. First of all, I assume that here we represent all of us European organizations. So UN, United Nations Security Council, and European Union, sanctions apply to us. This is for granted. However, it can be cases that OFAC sanctions or OFSI, the UK sanctions, US and UK respectively, sanctions would apply to the organization. If there is a nexus or even if there is no nexus with this extraterritorial reach as we heard before. All of that the organization needs to know about this. What applies to the organization, which regimes applies to the organization. It can be also other regimes, for example, Australia, Hong Kong, Canada, if it has operations over there. And it needs to know to which extent these sanction regimes apply to the organization. And then, if the organization ring fences the sanction regimes, then he can see the relevant lists, the relevant smart sanctions, executive orders, whatever comes out, and transpose that to the business of the organization. The next one is that the compliance officer is not enough. If we talk especially about a big organization, he needs to have small people like replicators inside the organization that would identify trading, red flags, anything that is in relation to sanctions and would escalate that. Then, of course, we need policy, what we do with sanctions, and a procedure on how we work with sanctions. Training is very crucial because people don't know much about sanctions. They've heard now the sanction topic with the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, but before that they didn't know, and actually they don't know how this works. And I will come to, if you have a factory and you invite somebody to see your production line, this is a sanction activity. If the person is designated, you transfer know-how to them. So even in this kind of cases. And another extreme case is that if you make an agreement while you are in the US, you apply a US nexus, which is very tricky. Or even if you use the infrastructure like US banking system, US dollar, which is something very innocent, very normal to the trade. But you will see afterwards on this kind of workshop how companies have been punished and paid a lot of fines for this kind of tricky things that they didn't know before. So training is very crucial. The importance of red flags is also crucial. Red flags is points that would identify that something is going wrong. Red flags can be one customer that doesn't identify where the product goes or who the end customer is. A customer that buys an equipment from you and says that, okay, this equipment needs to be transferred by trucks, okay? And he asks specifically for, let's say, a sealed package that identifies to you that this will go per ship. This is a red flag. You need to escalate that. And many others, like 20, 30 red flags that need to be escalated to the compliance officer who will investigate and will give the go or no go. Prohibitions, we said that before, products, service, know-how transfer, dual-use items that may be used for defense purposes. The next one is how are you doing the screening, the sanction screening? You have an entity you want to cooperate with, and you need to screen that. But first of all, is you get the sanction list by the various sides of the regulators of the applicable regimes, as we said before. OFAC has a nice tool. European Union doesn't have, has a PDF, so you have to search it with Control F, with a find thing. And if you don't know verbatim how it's written or how it's contained inside the PDF, then you lose the information. And things go even more difficult because we said before, Nicolas said before, that the lists are not complete. Some entities and physical persons straightforward, it's either yes or no, but entities may not be contained and they need to be considered as sanctioned because of ownership, the 50% ownership or the controlling dependency. So probably you need, either you go with a list as a first step, or you need a database, a kind of aggregator, as I call it. In a more advanced stage, if you have a lot of customers or suppliers that you are onboarding, then you probably need something automated. You don't search by hand, one by one. So you make an automation which is called this kind of API, which is practically integrating your ERP system to the aggregator and automatically returns results for you to resolve. Continuous monitoring is also crucial. Why? Because at the time of the onboarding, an entity can be fine, but a week later or a month later during the cooperation may be sanctioned. Very problematic. So you need to do a continuous monitoring on that during the cooperation. The UBO, the ultimate beneficiary owner, I will not stick into that, but this is to identify the legal ownership of your target entity and the physical person that owns the whole tree. And you need to check, to screen against the list any and all the entities that you have identified. Only that way the control will be complete. Then we heard about smart sanctions, sectoral sanctions. This is papers, legislation that we need to study. It's not lists, it is sectoral sanctions. It says that this item is prohibited to go to this X country, for example. Okay, and carries also some exceptions. The wind down periods, as we have heard about OFAC, the grandparenting of the contracts, which is rather difficult to study. That's why we said before, we need a sanction compliance officer that on the one hand studies the legislation and on the other hand knows the organization and the offerings, the product offering, so that it merges the two things and sees what is the impact on the organization. Something that we didn't talk about is the isolation of mostly US persons and UK persons. So if you have, let's say, a US citizens or residents inside your organization, you never make him make a decision about Iran, for example, about a US sanctioned territory. This is prohibited for him and for the organization. Considering the nexus situations, nexus is, as we said before, using infrastructure, currency. We have examples afterwards, practical examples what this means, and we end up with the second line of defense controls. What I described before is preventive controls, meaning that you apply all the items, all this kind of checklist, in order to make a prevention to the organization and to the people, to the employees, of course, not to get involved into sanctions. There are second line of defense controls, the compliance controls, that assure that all the processes, all the sanction processes, operate like it is designed. And that I turn to the next slide because this checklist is rather mixed, and I would say I thought of making a kind of maturity model because organizations that haven't heard about sanctions before need to start with something. So they can start with, number one, initialization, these ad hoc searches. They are aware about sanctions. They need first to understand the sanctions and the product offering. They need to do ad hoc screening, especially in high-risk regions, Iran, Syria, or neighborhood countries, and they can outsource the due diligences to external parties. So this is the very basic level, which offers the minimum safeguard for the organization. The second one is they start to emerge a discipline. I call it developing. So they name the compliance sanction officer, as I said before. They define applicable sanction regimes, the risk analysis, the applicability, as we said before. Identify activities, what are the activities of the company, in which regions, and they start doing in-house the manual screening. They take lists from the applicable regimes. They can move afterwards to the define, the responsive, as I call it, module. They develop a policy. Policy and procedure is very important for an organization to have. They start training the personnel to identify the risks and know when to seek advice, also very important, so nothing goes under the carpet. And they can obtain an aggregator. Aggregator means they don't use this kind of PDFs, they use a kind of online system where all the lists, they define all the applicable regimes and they get results. They put the name and they get results. One name, one search, many results. Instead of having many searchings to the various lists and questionable results. The managed, the next level, is they can connect their ERP to this aggregator for automated screening by the push of a button. It really works well. It's rather complicated to set up, but it really works well afterwards. Nominate compliance liaisons in the units, the people that are dealing with sanctions, not full-time, like the compliance sanction officer, but they are dealing with sanctions and they are able to identify the red flags if something goes wrong. Why you do that? You have people, you've made them aware, and you remove the noise. Noise means, small incidents, the false positives, from the plate of the compliance officer, the sanctions, to allow him to do the most important job. Sanction clauses, very important. You need to have in every contract. These are clauses which practically what they say, it's the legal language, how to opt out from a contract if the contractual party becomes sanctioned or gets involved into sanctions. And the last one is perform the impact analysis. These are small projects. When we say, the 9th, the 10th, the 11th package, these are small projects to identify what is the impact of these new packages, the EU packages, or the other one, the study with Xinjiang. You remember the Xinjiang that also Nicolas mentioned, which contains slavery, to identify what is this impact in your organization. If you have suppliers from Xinjiang, if the package, the Russian package, involves any of your activities, you need to identify them. Small projects, but you need to know where to search for that. And the optimized, the very advanced level, as I call it, is continuous monitoring, as we said before. Daily monitoring of all your customers and all your suppliers. If something changes, and what you receive, every day you receive alerts. You screen the alerts, and then if something is positive, is really positive, then you need to escalate that to the business unit to exercise the opt-out sanction clauses. Develop the second line controls. This is to provide assurance that whatever you have built over here, it really works. The people are screening, the people are escalating, the people are putting sanction clauses in the contracts, this kind of controls. Detective controls, as we call them. Then this is very important and very difficult to perform checks on all of your value chain, of the supplier of your supplier, of the supplier. Okay, that's really very difficult because you don't know the origin of the product, who buys from whom, unless you can do it by declarations, which is not a very good risk mitigator. And of course, the last one is to be an active citizen, an active organization, participating in conferences, in working groups, getting to know the latest information and also contributing. This is what I wanted to present you, and I think after this we have coffee break, and we can continue with Victor Pinto after the break with the third-party sanctions risk management.
So good evening. My name is Eleni Doga, and for the purposes of this discussion, I will be your moderator. Firstly, I would like to welcome you and introduce you to the aim of this panel discussion, which is first to provide you with a deeper understanding of of the sanctions risk that your organization may be exposed to, especially for the smaller businesses, and second, to offer you practical suggestions on how you can better mitigate the sanctions risk. So in order to ensure that the discussion is relevant to a wide range of attendees here today, we have assembled a group of 4 distinguished experts, 2 of them from different types of organizations. 2 of them are from the industry. On my left-hand side, you have Ms. Dimitra Anagnostou, Compliance Officer, Anagnostopoulou, apologies, Compliance Officer at Mytilineos, and Mr. Konstantinos Gemalidis, Group Compliance and Anti-Fraud Director at Titan Cement Company. And we also have online 2 participants. One is from the banking sector. This is Mr. Roy van Kolwijk, who is a Senior Sanctions Specialist at ING. And one is a Sanctions and Export Control Consultant. This is Ms. Stephanie Broekart. She's a lawyer and consultant in Sanctions and Export Controls at Megara Sanctions. She's also the founder of the consultancy. So our panelists here kindly accepted to share their insights and experience on how compliance officers should mitigate sanctions risks. But of course, this is just their personal opinion. It's not formal legal advice, and it should be taken into consideration with a grain of salt and on a case-by-case basis. So now to start off the discussion, I would like to also ask for your kind participation. So we have a question for you. How many of you believe that sanctions risk is particularly relevant to your organization? If you could just raise your hand, just to understand how interested you are in the topic. Okay, the majority of you are. That's why you're here, probably. Not everyone. Ms. Anagnostopoulou, what is sanctions risk for you and your organization? And how relevant do you think sanctions risk is for our attendees here today? Meaning, how far-reaching can sanctions be, really?
Okay, thank you for the invitation, the Association of Compliance Officer and Mr. Kravdakis. Thank you also, I forgot it. I assume that most of the people here represent European companies and Greek companies, but it's not evident that European companies are bound to abide by the EU regulations, and that they have to abide by US regulations also. So we are going to proceed to the first slide. I'm going to present you to highlight actually how the US nexus has been misused and in what means. It has been actually the definition of US nexus first. US nexus means anything that has to do with the use of the US infrastructures, the US financial system, the currency, for example, the US dollar, the ownership, subsidiaries that are conducting activities under US nexus, but the parent company is not a US company, the US element, the product, the software that can be used, any services, and other deceptive practices. In the next slide, I have gathered some settlement agreements and court cases from the last decade. If you can see it, I think you can see it. I started from the recent one. The recent one has to do that OFAC has settled an agreement with Swedbank Latvia for apparent violations of sanctions on Crimea. And that was because an individual who was located in US had
actually misused the financial system of US, and then it was considered that he was a US person and violated the prohibitions that OFAC has settled. There are more cases. The list is not exhaustive, actually. Apparently, many non-US companies end up to settle for their violations, even though they think in the beginning that they are not a US person, they are not considered US person, US company. In the next slide, there are also some examples about, for example, the British Arab Commercial Bank that is located in London, meaning that no offices, businesses, or presence under US jurisdiction, although processed to 72 apparent violations. And it's remarkable how companies that are located, incorporated, or established in another country misuse the US nexus. So even though some companies are by default located to another country, it doesn't mean that they cannot acquire US nexus. And to the next slide, we are going to proceed for some secondary sanctions and some companies that were designated because they could not settle an agreement with a FAC. It's because they transferred Iranian oil and they transferred Iranian oil and they used the US nexus, US system, financial system to pay, to transact amounts of payments, or they used the US nexus, for example, to transship the Iranian oil until the end country. So it's important to abide by the rules, to know the whole path and the whole end customer and the end company that will end up the whole destination in order to be compliant. And this is for me.
Great, thank you very much, Ms. Anagnastopoulou. Mr. Yamalidi, perhaps actually a question for the audience first. So, what are the biggest challenges that you face in relation to sanctions risk management at the moment? Does anybody wish to share with us what are the biggest problems you may have? For instance, lack of expertise among employees, data issues, issues with screening tools, other types of pitfalls you may have faced in relation to sanctions? Yes, please.
I find it difficult to identify the legal structure, the legal ownership of an entity, of the target entity that I would like to cooperate with, and of course the ultimate beneficial owner, in cases there are jurisdictions with no data. Then I have to rely on the declaration of the partner, but I cannot check it.
The presentation from Moody's, we said that we shouldn't scan only.
We need to scan all the whole tree.
Exactly. This is the whole challenge.
This is the challenge, yes.
Yes, we have all this information, but probably we can cover it through an enhanced due diligence. Meaning that probably we need to change the KYC process to get more information on this.
Correct, but this is not a kind of, it doesn't work always. Because even systems like Orbis, like other systems, competitors, they don't have information in some of the jurisdictions, which information is not publicly available for them to collect. And this is a challenge because you never know, and if something goes wrong, then they will turn to you, the authorities.
It is very complicated, and you have to see the overall transaction. I mean, even the banking relationship of the supplier. So the payment will be done in which jurisdiction? If it is a European bank, it is better, but if it is cross-border, a foreign bank, more difficult. So you have to see many things. If you have, if you don't have adequate information, you're saying.
Thank you.
Apart from difficulties regarding the existence of fraudulent and beneficial owners, do you encounter difficulties with respect to politically exposed persons as well?
This doesn't, this is relevant very much for the banks because they need to put a profile for the money laundering. For us that we want to cooperate, it's nice to know when we cooperate with a politically exposed person for anti-bribery reasons, to see if our money go to somebody in order to influence decisions in favor to us. This is the only views the politically exposed person knows.
Okay, thank you very much for the responses. Now let's go to our panelists. Mr. Yamalidi, what are the biggest challenges for a corporate like the one that you are working for?
Hello from my side. I would like to thank ASCO for the invitation and to thank also Eleni for introducing me as an expert. We're just struggling to cope with this high technical and critical issue in our organizations, as the consequences are severe in case of having a compliance failure on this topic. Regarding the challenges, I would say that these are, first of all, it is clear from Nicolas and Sophocles from the presentation and the very good overview on the subject that sanctions regulations form a very strict, complex and broad regulatory framework. It is a framework that we have to navigate through as we navigate through turbulent and stormy waters in the Aegean, for those who are sailing. I would say that the challenges are of different nature, coming from different sources, and vary as per their severity. I would group in four main categories. The first one has to do with the regulatory framework. The goals are mostly common among the sanctions regimes and the regulators, but the structure of the regulations is not identical. For example, in US, as per OFAC, we should refrain, it is prohibited to conduct any business activity. In EU, this is said as asset freezing. This is not exactly the same, and in some cases, the difference may be critical. A second element is, of course, that changes, the pace of changing changes in the regulations is very fast, and now it is coming in layers, the one over the other, and this creates gaps and in certain cases create also inconsistencies. Regarding the applicability, this is a great challenge, as already mentioned, because indirect applicability is equally important, and especially regarding the US regulations, apart from the indirect applicability or US nexus, we have also the secondary sanctions that are very, very important and very risky. Another point is ambiguity or generalization of some regulations, or the need, let's say, to collect different pieces of regulations in order to make a compilation and to conclude in what you should do and what you should avoid. One example is, okay, we all know that for EU regulations, EU regulations, EU sanctions regulations do not apply extraterritorially. They do not have an extraterritorial effect. This means that EU subsidiaries established in non-EU countries are exempted from the regulations. Up to this point, it is clear, and we all understand that for us, for example, that we have a subsidiary in Serbia, this is out of the whole picture. But it is not like this, because there are 2 points that are very critical, and you cannot find it exactly going in the same page with in the regulation. The first one is that EU nationals can be held liable in case they are working in the subsidiary. And the second thing is that the parent company also may be held liable for orchestrating or approving or initiating transactions. So if this you combine this together, practically means that also the subsidiaries should abide by the regulation, and this is the most safe. There are also some, as per our experience in Titan, we had several cases that we would like to have a clear guidance from, especially from EU authorities, that we did not. And I advise also to you, if you have such cases, because I did it, to ask the EU Commission. It takes some time, but in the end, they respond. For example, we had the case for the restrictions related to Russia. There is a very short sentence which triggers a lot of restrictions, saying that it is prohibited to purchase coal from Russia if it is exported from Russia, or if it is oriented from Russia. So what about transit? Because we had some cases that we were offered with coal shipments from Kazakhstan that supposedly they were transited through Russia. So it was totally unclear at that point of time. Maybe after my inquiry, it is included in the frequently asked questions, that transit is exempted. But then comes another problem. Okay, by conducting due diligence for this shipment, we were supplied with certificates of origin as per the ordinary procedure that were issued from the Russian Federation. So can we count on them? And this is not clear. Another example. There was a case of a shipment offered to us that was already entered EU through normal customs procedure. So if we have some goods that are already in the area of European Union, is it free to circulate across the Union? I searched a lot and I did not find any specific provision, even in the EU Customs Code. I had the opportunity to interact with the Deputy Director of OFSI, and I got a response, and also I may say that she confirmed that indeed there is a gray area regarding the regulation. So it needs a lot of searching, it needs a lot of clarity in order for us to be on the safe side.
And if we move on to controls.
Yes, sorry, Eleni, I have a lot to say. The second one, and I agree with Sophocles, is about data credibility. And what is the paradox here is when we are conducting due diligence, we need, and this is not a problem of the service providers of the tools, which are really excellent. It is about local registries. So in higher risk areas, we have the poorest local registry data. So as Sophocles said, we cannot have a very clear view on the ownership structure, for example, for a Sudanese company. So what do we have to do? Or by performing due diligence in vessels, in most of the cases, we come up to ownership structures in British Virgin Islands or Marshall Islands. So what do we have to do then? And there is no guidance for this. The third category has to do of challenges, has to do with our internal customers. It is not very easy, even though it is straightforward. Why we have to comply with these regulations? Of course, it is reasonable that the roles in an organization differ. So the salesman want to sell. We have to persuade them that they, as risk owners, as process owners, they have to perform a risk analysis in order to forward, to request or to highlight the case as risky. So a lot of challenges, and also the effort of the designated persons to deal with obscured ownership structures or employ various tools, let's say, to make our lives more difficult is a great challenge also.
And since you mentioned the cross-border transactions and shipments, Sophocles mentioned the sanctions clauses that are existing in most trade finance-related products. Can you tell us some things about sanctions clauses? Do you use them? How important do you think they are for corporates mostly?
Yes, of course, we do use sanction clauses in every contract. We have a great support from Group Legal in Titan Group. Sanctions clauses are important, and they have they aim in two things. The first one is, first of all, to get the assurance or the attestation, let's say, from our counterparty that it's not designated, it's not targeted by sanctions, or he's not owned or controlled, etc., which is very important. The second one is to be able to get, I would say, the consent in order to terminate the contract and not face liabilities after that because of violations of sanctions, and even in some stricter cases, if there are reasonable grounds to believe that there are or there will be violations of sanctions. You know, timing is a big issue, is a problem, is critical, because it is not enough to stop a payment, for example. We have to be proactive, because after signing a contract and after making a down payment, the goods are shipped, for example. There is a loss associated, and there is also a risk associated with this.
Thank you very much.
So, but just to add, Eleni, that it is not, it is acceptable by the regulators. Oh, let me say in a different way. Is this sufficient? Okay, we have sanction clauses and detailed sanction clauses. Wording is very, very important, very critical in having effective sanction clauses. But is it considered sufficient as a mitigating tool?
And are you able to terminate the relationship without having any repercussions? So lawsuits from counterparties that are in favor of them.
Yes, this is an issue, and it was also a case for force majeure in terms of COVID. It was many cases, but the regulators sometimes, no, the guidance, the overall guidance is yes, it is acceptable, and you have to use this attestation. An example is ναι, συγγνώμη. An example is a document from a guidance from OFAC that was released in March for the oil cap, the oil price cap, that accepted that attestation creates a safe harbor for the entities. But this should not be considered as sufficient, because to incorporate a clause in a contract is the easy way. It is not sufficient, because if we have a reasonable grounds to believe that something is wrong, we have to perform due diligence, and this is the requirement of the regulators.
Ms. Anagnostopoulou?
Thank you. I would like to add something. This is that having sanction clauses means that you can enhance your due diligence, your first line of defense, because by conducting due diligence, when you have a contract agreement, it means that you are proactive, and you can prevent a company, an organization, to lose its reputation. So it's very important and imperative to have sanction clauses involved in any agreement.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to sanction screening. Can you hear me? So standard practice shows that sanction screening is implemented in relation to customers, transactions, vendors, and employees. With regards to the timing of sanction screening, how many of you here today that you're working in the sanctions area are screening your customers and transactions prior to the initiation of a business relationship, and ongoing, but prior? Can you raise your hands? Okay, the majority does. And I guess most of you are in banks, or not? No? Okay. I hope Stephanie can hear us and respond to us. Ms. Brugart, banks standardly screen for sanctions prior to initiation of a business relationship. Should the same approach be followed by corporates too? Does size and exposure to different types of regimes play a role in that decision to screen prior to the initiation of a relationship?
Yeah, can you hear me this time?
Yes.
Are intensifying, and also export controls, which is something that traditionally is something that targets corporates more than banks. You see that intensifying, so that also means that more and more is expected from corporates as well when it comes to screening and export control, sanctions compliance. And I think we will see an increase in that also in the upcoming years from now.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Yamalidi, you would like to add something to it, right?
Yes, as we said before, timing is very, very important. We have to conduct due diligence early enough before going into a transaction, of course, for sure before signing a contract, but even before receiving maybe an RFQ. So what we do in Titan is that we conduct due diligence in a very, very early stage, and we try to avoid also any transaction that might be perceived as proceeding towards a business activity. For example, we had a case of samples that were requested from a legal entity, which was there were significant red flags associated. Samples to be sent to US, and this was stopped even before sending the sample. So this is very important, because we have to have in mind always that it is not only about penalties, it is also about the reputational risk that is associated with any failure or any negative publicity, let's say. that we were have been involved even without intent, because there is strict liability in this. So this is also very important.
Thank you very much. Now we go to Mr. Korvik. Which criteria do you use to screen your transactions, the financial transactions, for potential sanctions exposure?
Yes, thank you, Elaine. Can you hear me now as well? Just to be sure.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks all first for inviting me to act as a speaker here. I think the main things that we screen for in terms of alert generation are the obvious things, such as names, locations, and date of birth. But there are also a lot of other elements that you use, but they are more used to in the assessment state. So in order to make sure whether you are dealing with a true hit or a false positive. For this, for example, you can use a person's nationality or the gender as it was defined on the sanctions list. Usually these kind of information they're also provided. Also for previous trade names is advised to also screen against.
So now we are talking about customers, how customers are screened in a corporate, right? Not on transactions.
No,
Okay, perfect. And do you differentiate between natural persons and legal persons as well?
And in terms of screen, you have a little bit difference in which criteria you can screen against. For example, you cannot screen for the date of birth of legal entities, of course. But more or less the criteria will be the same. For example, you also would normally screen for the location. To give an example of that, in certain countries, for example, Ukraine, there are sanctions that are not applicable to the whole country, but only part of the country. So a person that is residing in the annexed regions are subject to sanctions that people in the other parts of Ukraine are not subject to.
Thank you very much. Ms. Anagnostopoulou, do corporates screen the same way as banks? I don't know, do you have an extensive KYC performed like the banking institutions?
We are trying to screen as a banking sector, actually. I think every industry, since under the regulations that we have, we are obliged to actually. Mainly we screen by the name, but secondarily, and since the most names are common enough, even the Chinese names can be written in Greek or in Latin. So it's difficult to identify a person, for example. We must proceed to obtain valid data like VAT number, which is a unique element for an individual or for a legal entity. And then we can proceed to identify the whole path, as Mr. Karapidakis said, and Mr. Yamalidis, the ownership structure from the target legal entity that is going to be a counterpart to our company until the ultimate beneficial owner, the direct shareholders or the indirect shareholders, that they are going to be counterparties in an agreement, and we have to be aware for the whole tree structure, as they said before.
Thank you very
whole
much.
representatives. Thank you.
So now we move on back to the transactions and we go back to non-financial transactions. So Mr. Yamalidi, which criteria do you use to screen your non-financial transactions?
Yes, for us, we have developed a comprehensive sanctions assurance program, and our perspective is it covers the whole aspects. We try to identify the risk streams that affect us throughout the life cycle of a transaction. First of all, what we are examining is the type of transaction. Regulations are not the same. It's not the same for buying cement, for purchasing cement from Russia, then selling cement to Russia. Also, what will be the use of the material? Cement is not a dual-use good, of course, or a control item needing a license, but the use of cement is important because we may fall into regulations saying that it is prohibited to aid sectors of the Russian economy, for example, such as defense or energy sectors. So if we have a request in the hypothetical scenario, we did not have any to sell cement to Russia, what will be the use for it? This is very important. So we have to understand deeply the nature of the intended transaction.
So,
Also,
so that means the end buyer,
the
between all of these.
exactly. In order to avoid indirect applicability, which is very, very risky, we have to ensure the origin of raw materials. And this is difficult, very difficult. And we have to ensure also the final destination of our products in terms of sales or exports. And this where the attestation has a very important role to play in this. Of course, the third party goes without saying, up to the UBO and all associated red flags with the third party. The routing. Also, this is a critical detail. As I said in the previous example, it is not allowed to purchase coal from Russia, but it is allowed for shipments to transit through Russia. So what will be the routing of the material? The transportation. We have to ensure that vessels are not targeted. And recently, and in terms of the 11th package, which is focused mainly on circumvention of sanctions, which is also very important, but not with a great courage, I may say. The deceptive practices of vessels are very, very important to be able to identify early enough. Because according to the 11th package, if there are reasonable suspicions that the vessel employs deceptive practices such as flag hopping or switching off the AIS signal or ship-to-ship transfers, the accessibility to EU ports may be prohibited. So this is an end-to-end, and this is an issue that is very important because also to our internal customers, what comes to their mind at first when addressing the sanctions issue is, okay, who is our counterparty? Is Eleni? Eleni is clean, so we're good. We can proceed. No, it's not like this. It's an end-to-end process.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kolvik, from the banking sector, how do you screen transactions, including payment messages, other types of financial transactions, and what kind of data points do you screen against?
Yeah, I think that it's good that you mentioned that because what we screen for really depends on also which type of transaction we're talking about. If you're talking about, let's say, how we call it clean payments, so they are just transactions initiated from normal bank accounts. In those, we can only screen for all the information that's available, but sometimes you do not have all that information because customers do not always give all the details of a transaction in a simple message. So they usually only provide an invoice number. So for these kind of transaction, it's it's very difficult to get all the information that's there. So you just screen on the information that is available to you. So you can screen against all the banks that are involved, including the big codes, and you screen on any information that is provided. But if you're talking about, for example, trade finance messages, you will go a lot further than that, because then your presence is a lot bigger. So, and I think this has just also been explained with several examples what to screen for. But in that case, you look indeed what's the origin of the goods, what is the destination of the goods, which vessels are involved, what's the transport route of the goods, all these kind of things you then screen for. So a simple set, you screen all the information that's available, but based on which kind of activity you are performing, you might need to do more research than, for example, you can do with just clean payment.
And just to add to this, what is the responsibility of the bank in relation to the responsibility of the trader? Is it the same, or it's more in the sense of an enhanced due diligence on the transaction?
So for the transactions that are trade finance, it's the same, because as a bank you're also providing what could be seen as financial assistance. So you are also expected to do all these checks.
Thank you very much. Now we move on to employee screening. Ms. Brookhart, could you explain to us the reason why employees should also be screened for sanctions?
Yeah, for the simple reason actually that they can end up at a sanction list, right? And we see like an explosion of people being added to sanctions list. It's very widely used generally, and obviously there's also people that work within our organizations that can end up at a sanctions list. So you want to indeed screen all your employees, but you also want to do that on a regular basis. So continuous screening.
And we also collect information like nationality and citizenship. Why is that relevant too? Especially for big regimes.
Yeah, because you need it to basically identify the hit. So you're going to see it on the sanction list, what the nationality is of a certain listed person. Well, you have to match it against the information of that you have from the employee side. And then there's, of course, the little bit of the thing that we talked about before, that you want to identify US and UK person and EU person, EU, that's also coming up more and more, because the applicability of these regimes to your organization. So it depends a bit on, you'll have to really take a look at which jurisdictions apply to me primarily. And then you have to also think about, okay, what is the secondary nexus, as you want to call it, that may pull in a hook, basically, as you could call it, that would make those regimes, those sanction regimes, applicable, even though they're not primarily applicable to you. So, for example, you are a purely EU-based company and you have a UK person leading your division or your department, which could be pull in a UK nexus. So that's something that you want to consider.
Thank you very much. Now back to you, Mr. Kolbeck. What are the most significant changes in the sanction screening requirements for banking institutions since the start of the Ukraine war? So with a focus on EU.
Yeah, I think if we look at really the sanctions requirements, they did not change that much, because in the regulation they don't really refer in detail how you should screen. They really place that responsibility on financial institutions. However, there has been and it's logical, I think, an increased focus on how banks are dealing with their sanctions risks. So over the last years, since the start of the war, we got a lot of questions from multiple regulators how we are effectively dealing with that. And that can be what was very challenging, to be honest, because based exactly in the time that there was already an increased workload due to the new sanctions, you also have to at the same time have discussions on the requirements with regulators. I think what also I think changed is that For the other comprehensive sanctioned countries, in many cases there was like a total ban on imports. But with Russia, it really went step by step, and each time new goods are added to the sanctions list, to the prohibited goods list, let's say. So every time you need to look in your screening how you are going to add these additional new sanctions, which is not only also goods, but also services. So in time, you also need to assess, okay, which customers are providing these kind of services to Russia. So all these different steps, and every time you need to reassess the new sanctions that are there and how you're going to effectively implement your controls to mitigate these risks. I think that is one of the most significant challenges over the last years for financial institutions.
And what kind of specific controls have you implemented on top of the existing ones to mitigate the Russian sanctions? Do you have any suggestions for our attendees?
So yes, we analyzed the list of goods and services that are added to the sanctions list that are prohibited, and we added certain keywords to be filtered out in the system. So let's say there are sanctions on providing advertisement services, then you can add, for example, advertising, those kind of keywords to your screening. And in addition, you provide the list of goods to your to the teams that are responsible of the export control framework. So when they're straight finance, there you can really do a detailed check. If these goods are going to an embargoed country, they can do an assessment if these goods are actually prohibited or not.
Thank you very much. Any other suggestions for controls implemented specifically for Russia?
I would like to add something, but not only for controls, concerning the screening process, that it's important the media adverse plays a vital role also, along with the other screening names and anything else that we have to screen in order to be transparent to the other counterparties also.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Perhaps geolocation as well could play a role in that. Ms. Broekart, could you suggest any useful sources that the compliance officer should absolutely have in their sanctions toolkit? And those are the ones presented on the screen.
Yeah, they are indeed presented on the screen. So the middle one is what I would call primary sources. Those are the main government websites. There's links that are included here. So we have the EU website and the EU sanctions map. I think that's a very practical one in the sense that it also includes UN sanctions, and you have a really nice overview that allows you to click on the individual countries, and it gives you an overview, a recap of basically the EU sanctions that are applicable. There's, of course, the OFAC website from the US side of things. They just renewed the website. I think they did a good job on it, actually. It's a bit more centralized now. It's a little bit more well organized than it used to be. So it's really worth checking out. You can also, it is sorted by country and by program, and you find all the information and all the links to the individual websites. There's for the export control side, there's the USBIS website. Same thing, it's not as elaborate, but there's some good information on it on the export control sides. Then, of course, there's the US sanction regulations, the so-called CFR, where the actual, from the US side of things, it is typically executive orders or acts that are being implemented in the regulations. So the regulations you want to check as well. And there's also a link to that. Same with the US export control regulations, the EAR. And then, of course, we have UN sanction regulations that has a separate website from the UN side. And you will also find, for example, the reports from the UN expert committees, which sometimes can be useful if you're, for example, dealing with a UN sanction concern or transaction that may be hit by UN sanctions. So that's the primary sources. Then we have the compliance program design. I think it was highlighted a couple of times already, but there's a couple out there, mainly from the US side, which is the OFAC compliance commitments. It gives you a little bit of a framework of the elements that should be part of your compliance program. The US Department of Justice also did a similar one, which is a corporate compliance program, but it is also relevant for building a sanctions program, I would say. We don't really have one from the EU side for sanctions, but we have a little bit of an older one. That is the EU internal compliance program, which is actually a dual use or export control program. So that can be very useful for the US or the EU export control side to map that against your own program. Then, of course, we have screening. We talked a whole lot about screening today, obviously. We included here the main websites that are issued by the governments. So obviously the governments are responsible for sanctioning or putting entities and parties to a sanctions list, and they publish that, and they also publish consolidated lists. OFAC has a very nice searchable one, so you can just search the name of the party that you're looking for, and it will give you the result of the program that is applicable. The EU and the UN have consolidated lists that you can download and screen. But of course, it doesn't give you the nice, what we call enhanced list with the 50% and those type of elements to it. For that, you will need to go to a third-party vendor like Moody's. There's updates and analysis. Obviously, there's a lot of information out there for you to digest, especially when there's new ones coming out. So there's a lot of law firms and specialized consultants that do updates and analysis of new packages and generally about any news coming out on the sanctions front, also for enforcement, for example. And other types of new things coming out, which is obviously our own website, Megara. And then we have World ECR, which is a magazine on export control mostly, which does a lot of analysis. Same for Export Compliance Manager. There's the Daily Bugle, which is very well known within the sanctions community, if you want to call it that. It's basically it gathers in a daily newsletter all very relevant posts and blog posts that were done by law firms and specific type of news blogs from the main news sites. So that's a little bit of a must, I would say. It's done by Full Circle Compliance, a consultancy firm. There is the Association of Certified Sanctions Specialists that also does all kinds of updates. And then there is a couple of other law firms that obviously do the updates, from which I think the Baker McKenzie ones are always really good. Guidances are being issued by governments. If you're really setting up your compliance program, especially if you're based in the EU, so your compliance program is going to be very heavily reliant or based on the EU regulations, I think you want to take a look at the 3 guidances that are out there from the EU side, which is the best practices, the guidelines, and the basic principles, which basically gives you an idea and foundation really on how EU sanctions work. They give some information on 50% rule and all those kind of things. So a very useful source, I think, as a basis. And there's, of course, the FAQs that the EU is doing from the Russia side. And it's becoming very, very extensive at the moment because, of course, the EU has been looking at what OFAC is doing, who has been working with OFAC or FAQs for a very long time. It's very useful. And so it is happily copying that from the US to also start implementing these FAQs. So there's loads of them right now from the Russia side. So always also very useful to just go through those to see if there's any guidance, if you have any specific questions. Last but not least, enforcement side. OFAC, of course, has their famous enforcement actions, which are basically a 1 or 2 pager, which gives you the highlights of enforcement actions that they do or settlements. And there's always a lessons learned to be done. So we would always recommend, if you're building a compliance program, to keep a close eye at these OFAC enforcement actions and see if there's any interesting elements that you could learn from and implement into your own program, or identify weaknesses in your own program. And then the last one is, of course, there may be locally applicable laws. So, for example, if you're based in the UK, if you're based in Canada and Switzerland, even these days, of course, you need to identify the jurisdictions that are applicable to you and keep a close eye on the local laws and regulations that apply to you.
Thank you very much for all the guidance. This will be shared with you afterwards. And this last slide concludes our discussion on the third-party sanctions risk management. We hope you found it useful. And I would also, with this, like to express my appreciation to our participants who kindly accepted to share their experience. And if you have any questions, you can also send them over to Sekase and we will try to respond to them. So thank you very much.
So I'm Victor Pinto. I'm heading up the solutions specialist team in Moody's Analytics for KYC, KYB, KYX. I've been with the company for the past 17 years, working in several different areas around risk management. And I'm based out in Paris, and I'm covering the European and African region. So today, over the next 20 minutes, I hope you still have energy. It's 7 p.m., okay? So bear with me, please. We're gonna talk about third-party sanctions risk management, but I would like to extend it a little bit beyond only sanctions and talk about some other risks, because I think it's important in the context of TPRM. I would also like to touch base on an ideal framework on how to start building your TPRM workflow and achieve continuous monitoring. That resembles a lot of what Mr. Sophocles just presented, but I will talk about it in a more solutions way, in a more systemic workflow software and solutions way, because that's my background and that's what I've been doing with Moody's Analytics. Okay, so to start, let's talk a little bit about the current environment that we have. Well, over the years, every time I see a presentation around risk management, it always starts like this. We're living in a challenging environment. It's difficult nowadays. It's always the case. I mean, there will always be challenges, but the challenges, they change. And the challenges, they change according to the audience that is listening to these challenges, right? If I'm talking to bankers, it will be different. If I'm talking about credit risk, it will be different. But in your case, compliance officers, the challenges, they stem from geopolitical. We talked a lot about the geopolitical situation. There is also high interest rates, high inflation that is putting pressure on your suppliers. So that is putting their balance sheet in difficulty. And a supplier that is in financial distress or in financial difficulty is a supplier that presents a higher risk for you. So that will, well, probably generate more work for you because you need to manage these risks more accurately. We have also the emergence of new risks. There is ESG, for instance. That's not a brand new subject. We've been talking about ESG for years now, but it has become more and more important. And we see companies in every industry all over Europe being more and more interested in ESG scores. There is cyber risk also. So we see many companies interested in cyber risk data, cyber risk scores to enter their TPRM assessment model. And there is something that I find very interesting is the aftermath of COVID. Before COVID, companies could work in a just-in-time supply chain basis, right? Since COVID, since we saw this big disruption in supply chain networks, companies have, you know, this is your daily job, but companies have been obliged to first of all, diversify their supply chain. So when we talk about diversifying a supply chain, we talk about increasing the number of suppliers. So if you need to work with more suppliers now than before, just to minimize your risk, you are increasing your workload. And something that sometimes is neglected is that companies, besides diversifying the number of suppliers, they are also diversifying the geography of these suppliers. Many companies that were concentrated, for instance, a lot in Asian suppliers for some types of products, they are diversifying to other regions of the world. So if you were used to addressing risks in a given region, you will need now to address these risks in different regions. So it's also more workload on your side. So more suppliers, more risk, and different risks puts a lot of pressure on your side. And as we say here in the bottom, news travel fast and bad news faster. So when you have this complex network, the chances that bad news will travel faster than you can identify them, that will cause a big reputation damage to your companies, is very high if they are not managed properly. So we recently have done a survey on TPRM on 41 different companies across Europe in different types of industries. And here on the left, we see what they said. They said that 70% said they are growing, they are increasing their investment in terms of headcount and budget. 30% said that they are stabilizing their investment. Probably they have invested in the previous years. No one said they are reducing their investment. Okay. And I have some testimonies here on the right. So this company that said that their budget's growing 5 to 10% per year, that they have seen a budget increase in more staff, because more risks, more suppliers, more regions of the world, more staff. Here on the right, we see this testimony of someone saying that they need tools to be able to run a proper TPRM. What we realize is that many companies are working in different silos with the different types of risks. We talked a lot about sanction risks, but there's also, as we mentioned, cyber risks and ESG and adverse media and political exposure persons, etc. By working in silos, you are only demultiplying the effort needed to cater for these risks. Also, on that survey that we've done, we've asked compliance officers how satisfied they are with the level of visibility they have on the risk. So we're not asking about their solutions, their systems. We are just asking about the visibility they have, which is, the result is quite edifying. We see that only 31% here on the right are satisfied with it, but 69% are not satisfied with the vision they have with the risk. So it means that they are probably addressing well some risks that they are used to, but they are probably struggling to address other risks. Just to move away a little bit from only TPRM, we did a similar survey, but this one is from 2022. The previous one is 2023, where we asked compliance executives more on KYC, and the result was very similar. We asked them if they were happy with the level of sophistication of their solutions. Same thing, less than 30% were satisfied with that, and the vast majority rate themselves as poor or mediocre in terms of KYC solutions that they have. So the conclusion, we dressed a bit the conclusion of this survey in this diagram representing the challenges that these respondents, they told us. So they have segmented the challenges in primary and secondary challenges. What they consider as primary challenges are, starting from the top, the first one is, of course, is balancing the compliance effectiveness with customer experience or with operational efficiency. So it's to be able to at least grasp, understand, and address those main risks. The second challenge among the primary challenges is data quality. You can have the best models, the best people, the best workflows, the best systems, whatever. if you don't have good data, of course, you will not be able to address these risks. And I think we talked about this during this day a lot. Nicolas, when he presented sanctions, when he talked about integrated ownership or control power on a company, this is all based on data. If you don't have this data, it's difficult to of course, to address the risks accordingly. Another one, staffing challenges. When we're talking about different types of risks with increasing regulations, with increasing pressure you need to maintain, and that's your teams, right? Maintain different teams to address different types of risks. That's a lot of people that need to stay there, who need to avoid turnover because they understand your risks, they understand your systems, your processes, etc. That's also a challenge for companies. And of course, keeping up with fast-changing regulations. But what I find interesting here is what they identified as secondary challenges might fall into the 2080 rule, that like 20% of these challenges might be representing 80% of the workload, because that's where companies are spending a lot of time, a lot of personal resources, a lot of budget in managing their TPRM different risks in a non-automated way. So one of the topics that they mentioned is dealing with false positives. We talked about false positives in sanction screening. False positives require a lot of manual work if you don't have the right solutions, if you are not using, for instance, artificial intelligence to identify false positives. That will generate a lot of manual work from you. Operating in a global environment, we've seen a number of companies who have subsidiaries all over the world and who are managing all these risks in different silos. So you need, well, needless to say, right, you need to demultiply the teams and demultiply the process. And sometimes a screen that you're doing in the Americas is not using the same database, the same solution of a screen that you're using in Europe. So this is also a concern that increases a lot the costs. And of course, then achieving a compliance culture and the cost of compliance that at the end is the consequence of all of this. So, what we've been proposing to our customers, and this slide is the one that looks like similar to the one you presented, right? Because what we didn't discuss about this before, right? It was a coincidence. So what we've been proposing to our company, to our customers, and we have received a very positive feedback on that, is a path towards continuous monitoring. This path starts with first, obtaining the data in an automated way. Earlier today, we talked about APIs. If you manage to obtain all the data from all the risks that you have to manage through APIs, so APIs, application programming interfaces, automatic connections to the data providers so that you can automatically obtain the risk data, feed your risk assessment models, and take your decisions. All of this in an automatic way, even without the need of pressing one button. This is the beginning of the digital transformation, is automating that. For that, well, you need to have a good data provider that will provide you with ownership structure and all the sanctions and with updated sanctions and adverse media, etc. But these providers also need to have the technical capability to feed this data for you through APIs if you want to automate the process. Second step, once you have achieved a good automation, is to use then TPRM as an advantage. What I mean by here is once you can quickly identify that one of your suppliers is high risk, and you can quickly ditch that supplier and quickly onboard another one, for instance, you are gaining a competitive edge here. I was discussing the other day with a customer that said that it was in the telecom industry. Their suppliers are the same suppliers as their competitors. There's a reduced number of suppliers in some industries. So the quicker you can work with a supplier, the more streamlined, the easier it is to work with this supplier, the more they will want to work with you, and that will bring you a competitive edge. And then the last step, which is then continuous monitoring, is the proactive management of risk. It is defining what data points are part of your risk models, what is your risk appetite, and what are the risk triggers that will automatically trigger a reassessment of your risk models. We'll talk about this a little bit more in detail in one next slide. Okay, so more in detail, the framework for this solution, we split it in three different phases. Three different phases. The first one is the third-party onboarding controls. So I already mentioned that. It is obtaining company information. According to your industry, you might also want to obtain company documentation real-time from the registry. We have, especially in banks, we have customers doing this. They connect real-time to registers all over the world, and they obtain a company document. You might want also, or for sure you want, to obtain firmographics, maybe ESG scores, cyber data scores, and of course, ownership structure. Ownership structure, needless to say, one of the most important topics in KYC, KYS, TPRM, etc. Once you manage to obtain all these, preferentially in an automated way through APIs, as I mentioned, you're ready to go to the screening part. So you need this data before going to screening. Otherwise, you will screen only, what was the example from Nicola, VEB. VEB translates into 200, I think, Nicola, what do you say? Yeah. VEB, the Russian bank, translates into 200 other companies that are all sanctioned by extension. So if you don't have a good corporate structure that will feed your screening, you won't be able to spot all of them. So then you get the screening part, comes with adverse media if this is part of your risk assessment models, public exposed persons, etc. And that's also here where you can obtain huge gains of productivity by using artificial intelligence to reduce the false positives. That's in the screening part that you generate a lot of false positives. And then the last part is the ongoing monitoring, automating all these through the definition of your risk triggers. Let's talk a little bit about these risk triggers that I mentioned. If you're willing to put in place continuous monitoring model, you need to define, according to your industry, to your risk appetite, to your risk assessment models, what are the internal and what is the internal and external data that is material or not material for you. I'll give you an example. Internal data that is material might be the average deal size of a supplier. A supplier that today is very small, has very, very small amounts of business with you, might be considered for you a very low risk because of the small amounts. If tomorrow the supplier increases its volume and starts dealing with large amounts for you, maybe they will be, according to your risk models, a medium or high risk supplier. So this is part of the risk triggers that you need to identify in your framework. And if your systems are configured, are able to push back this information as an alert, but to feed back your risk model, you will identify this automatically. There is non-material risk that you might want to leave outside of your risk models. For instance, if the supplier has changed bank account to another bank, well, normally, okay, this I won't put this in my risk model, so that will not raise a reassessment of that supplier. But it becomes more tricky when you're talking about external data. And then the classical example is that company that is always green, they are low or medium risk, and then they are acquired by another company, whose mother company has someone who is in a sanctions list, and then that company becomes sanctioned by extension. So you will be able only to spot this company as being switching from low risk to high risk if your sanction system is able to trigger that in your risk models in an automatic way. So it means it's moving away from the yearly or every 3 years or every 5 years reassessment to an assessment that happens without you doing anything. I mean, you're just waiting and things are triggered automatically. So the point is that identify what are the triggers and make sure that whatever the solutions you have that will provide you these data, they have the technology to push this data to your workflow. There's two technologies involved here, and there are solutions that have APIs that enable you to interrogate and ask for information in your and obtain this information to your risk models during your workflow. This is one. But the second technology is being able to push down changes in that information, push it down to your workflow. It's not exactly the same things, two different types of techniques. So if you have both, you'll be able to do the continuous monitoring. Okay? So last, just to summarize key takeaways, right? It's a increasing number of suppliers, increasing number of risks, increasing diversity of suppliers in different countries, different regions of the world. Challenges related to that, increasing manual work, increasing workload on your teams, and investment on this curve that I showed that will lead you from the digital transformation to continuous monitoring. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. The graph was not was similar, but not the same. Yours was exponential. Mine was a learning curve. And I was very glad to hear, however, now to be serious, I was very glad to hear the data privacy concerns that you mentioned. I'm mentioning that because many times we're being checked for KYCs as a company, and they give us all the board of directors, the managers' names, and their IDs or passports. This is not needed. Only if you have false positives, then you need the date of birth in order to distinguish if the bad one is the person that you are searching for. In all other cases, you don't need to hunt away personal data. This is according to GDPR data minimization concept. And now I would like to call Mr. Christos Ligeros to tell us about the importance of the UBO, the ultimate benefit of identifying the ultimate beneficiary owner.
In the next less than 20 minutes, we will try to approach one of the most complex issues that concern the global AML and CFT community, at least the last 20 years. The issue concerns the verification of the ultimate beneficial owner of every legal entity. The content of the presentation includes three parts. The first, regulatory requirements for beneficial owners. The second is challenging and transparency in determining the beneficial owner. And last, the financial action task force registry approach versus current EU and Greek reality. The term beneficial ownership goes back to the United States Security Act of 1933. At that time, the main goals were to ensure financial transparency and to establish stricter laws against fraud in security markets. Afterwards, authorities over the intervening years update the laws, and we now have a more detailed definition when it comes to the UBOs. What has this definition? Understanding whom we do business with is a fundamental regulation requirement. When shareholders' relationships are transparent, the true beneficial owner is visible. And if transparency is absent, the identity of the true beneficial owner is hidden. The guiding principle should be that the information of every UBO should be accurate, adequate, up-to-date, and accessible in a timely manner. Effectiveness can be demonstrated by adherence to these key principles, regardless of the form, mechanism in which the information is held. Sorry. Considering these three key principles we have just mentioned, transparency is the cornerstone of our entire effort. How can we ensure transparency? We can, if we manage easily and simply recognize UBOs, easily understand who has the direct or indirect control of the company, and if we can distinguish between ownership, beneficial ownership versus legal ownership. Legal person should be aware of their own structure and know their beneficial owners. Unwillingness of inability to declare their beneficial owner or owners of financial entities should be raised red flags. However, things in everyday reality are not that simple and transparent. Thus, begin a game of discovery, an effort of patience and insistence to be able to connect the dots, so that at the end of the reveal, the ultimate beneficial owner will be found. At the end of the exercise, please keep in mind that transparency over ultimate beneficial ownerships remain exception and not the rule. 20 years ago, in 2003, FATF was the first international body who set global standards on beneficial ownership. Last March 2022, FATF adopted amendments to recommendation number 24 and agree to immediately start the work to update guidance on beneficial ownership with a view to help support the implementation of the new requirements. The FATF's objectives was to strengthen the international standard on the beneficial owner of legal persons, to ensure greater transparency about the ultimate ownership and control of legal persons, providing competent authorities timely access to adequate, accurate, and update beneficial ownership information, and to take more effective action to mitigate the risk of misuse. What are the common challenges identified by FATF for the implementation of the measures regarding beneficial owners? You can see that challenges in this slide. FATF, to address these challenges, propose adopting a multi-pronged approach. That approach have two main areas, at the left and the second at the right. different approach supplement each other. That means that we have to concentrate to regulatory approach. The second, more accurate and up-to-date information to timely basis. Earning information approach and company approach are the areas. Balancing the need of obtaining information on beneficial ownership of foreign legal persons and ensuring legitimate business operation of them, countries can consider adopting the following FATF approach. And this is because imposing restriction of activities of foreign legal person may affect a country different foreign investment. The next slide gives us the picture of Greece 4 years back regarding the two controversial FATF recommendation 24 and 25. The evaluation of these areas was LC, which means that we are in a process that we have to do some more things in the areas as you see in the left side of the slide. And we will close with a brief reference to the registry approach of FATF and to the importance of the organizational of central registry in the European Union and beyond. As you can see in the slides, 4th and 5th AML directives give us the full outline of how EU central registries should be organized, operate, be accessible, and cooperate with each other. However, the reality is different and falls short of expectation at last until today, and especially after the decision regarding the accessibility of the European Court of Justice last November 22. Here you can see what the Court of Justice of the European Union focused on. And where it focused, it was that the public cannot have access to the registry. The decision of the Court of Justice make a confusion in the behavior of national central registers, which is reflected by the international transparency in these slides. At the left side, you can see what was before, and at the right side, you can see how the registry worked. However, in the other side of Atlantic, in the USA, the measures regarding the adoption of central registry are proceeding quickly and rigorously in their implementation, so that at the beginning of 2024, the registry will be operational. At the end of the day, dear friends, the effectiveness and efficiency of central registers in Europe, America, and the whole world will be measured by the completeness and quality of information regarding beneficial owners and legal persons. This will be ensured by a common language, a common standard that will be adapted and applied by all. And in this direction, the world community is moving with the Beneficial Ownership Data Standard, BODs. What does BODs include? They include data in 3 pillars: about individuals, about companies, will include, and about relationship. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, the presentation regarding the importance of identification of beneficial owners and difficulties and challenges has come to the end. For those who are interested and want to study more, I list some basic sources of information. Making the short trip on the occasion of today's workshop regarding the prerequisite and measures for the management of beneficial owners, and above all, living the reality of the matter in the exercise of my duties as money laundering reporting officer, Murphy's Law spontaneously came to my mind. Anything that can go wrong will go. Nothing is as easy as it looks, and everything takes longer than you think it will. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christos. And now I would need to call Transcrime. Unfortunately, Antonio wasn't able to travel because of a flight cancellation, but we will have him on the screen very soon. I hope.
This is me. I hope you can see me.
Yes, we can see you. Antonio, welcome to our event.
Can you see my presentation?
We can see your presentation and yourself. Thank you.
This is very good. So thanks a lot for inviting me. Unfortunately, I couldn't be here with you. So Mr. Victor Pinto said that most presentation starts by saying that we live in difficult times, but we should highlight why, what are the challenges. So probably flights cancellation is one of the of the challenges that we live in this time. But jokes apart, thanks for the invitation. Brief introduction on who I am and what I will be talking about. So I'm a senior researcher from Transcrime. It's a research center on transnational crime of Università Cattolica in Milan, in Italy. We have 30 years of activities, and we have conducted more than 200 projects at EU and local level. We also have a spin-off company that basically translates into solution for businesses and public authorities the results of our research. So we'll be talking about our activities in the detection of risks in the ownership, but also in the characteristics more in general of companies and vessels. We have a research hub inside Transcrime that is specialized in the analysis of firm ownership and in general its relation with illicit behavior. So our motto somehow is that we need to focus not only on who controls company, but also on how this control is carried out. And I will show you why. So a few words on our collaboration. So since we are talking about sanctions, we have an ongoing collaboration with Europol and the European Commission for tracking the assets of sanctioned individuals, which is currently ongoing. And we are also collaborating with a number of EU, but also Greek authorities in some EU projects. So I will bring these examples also to this session. So the idea is to briefly highlight how legitimate companies are using criminal schemes. And as Nicola Passariello was saying, this is an increasing trend that we see from investigative evidence, but also from academic literature from our point of view. Why we need to go beyond compliance list and the need for risk assessment, and then some examples from our EU level projects. I know this is it is late in Greece, and you're all looking for the networking. So I will try to be a bit practical and summarize the main points and the main takeaways of our research. So basically, there is an increasing use, as said, of legitimate companies in a number of illicit schemes. And most of them, as also stressed by Nicola, seem to be somehow related. So there are cross links among corruption, organized crime, money laundering, sanction evasion, and there is also an increasing employment of complex and cross-border structures, often employing circuitry jurisdictions or legitimate or legal arrangements that do not facilitate the identification of beneficial owners, as explained in the last session. Also, the theme and the hype around vessels is increasing, and also in the characteristics of vessels, it is important again to look at ownership. 75% of vessels that do not have owners available or easily reachable have been proven to be heavily connected to sanction violation and in general manipulation of location signals. So it is important to have somehow a view over all these risks. So I'm bringing you some examples from different domains. These are companies that were infiltrated by organized crime in Italy, which is, of course, one of the main area of expertise for us. And as you can see on the left, there is a complex scheme that was used for infiltrating public procurement and found so from a Cosa Nostra, so a Sicilian mafia family, using different companies with interlocking shareholding links and the use of figureheads and a heavy use of female figureheads, relatives of the ultimate beneficial owners. On the right, another company infiltrated by another criminal group in Italy, the 'Ndrangheta, with a very complex ownership structure crossing multiple jurisdictions and making it very difficult to identify the beneficial owner, exploiting a Dutch foundation that does not disclose the identity of the owners. And now some examples from other domains. So sanction evasion, 2 vessels, one Liberian flagged, transferring oil from a Russian flagged tanker off the coast of Greece. Again, here we have other risk factors such as the use of flags of convenience from countries that do not provide somehow do have laxer legislations on flag registries. And here cases similar to the one showed in the previous sessions of sanction circumvention with the exploitation of complex and anomalous ownership structure to conceal the identity of sanctioned individuals. So why did I show you all these cases? What do they have in common? What is the common denominator? Well, 2 things. First of all, risk factors that we can identify in their characteristics, and also the fact that none of these cases would have been discovered by just looking at compliance lists. So you wouldn't see enforcement, negative news, or the presence of sanctions by only looking at the presence of these entities and individuals on compliance lists. So there is a need. This has been stressed already in previous sessions. So I'm happy that I come as last, so I don't have to repeat. But we need to go compliance lists, especially because of a selection bias. Schemes are planned in order to circumvent controls. So if we want to have a predictive, a preventive approach, we cannot rely only on the evidence, because the evidence is just related to what is out there and has been already discovered. So we have to be one step ahead. This is what a Greek philosopher used to say, but I just took it from the internet because I don't know Greek, so I hope it is correct. But apparently he was saying that all we know is that we don't know. I hope the translation is correct somehow. This doesn't mean that we don't know anything, but there is a chunk of information that we don't know. And so it is important to have a risk-based approach and to remember that we have to look not only at who controls firms, but also how this control takes place and how we can identify red flags and recurrent characteristics in companies and vessels that somehow could signal the presence or a connection with illicit behavior. So This is a scheme on how we work in this domain. So basically what we do at Transcrime in our research project, normally we start from the analysis of risk factors, taking scientific or academic studies, legislative references such as the anti-money laundering directive that lists a number of risk factors for companies potentially linked to money laundering schemes. We look at guidelines such as the FATF evaluations, but also we look at case studies, investigations, and also we can rely heavily on expert inputs because we collaborate with a number of public authorities that have a specific knowledge of several domains of operations. The importance of data has been stressed in all the previous sessions, but let me just jump on that train. So the schemes are getting more and more complex, but also the information is getting richer. So if we are able to start from a knowledge of red flags, risk factors, and combine it with the knowledge of all the available data source, then we can operationalize, we can use analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning to construct sets of risk indicators and models that can help us in evaluating risks. So this is more or less the scheme, our methodology, and I will bring you some examples from two research projects. One is called Datacross, is an interesting project that we are carrying out with several partners from various EU countries. So there is also the Greek National Transparency Authority involved, but there are several law enforcement agencies, including the French police, the Romanian police, the Spanish police. Europol is participating to this project, a number of anti-corruption agencies and competition authorities, but also investigative journalists. What are they doing? What are we doing in this project? Designing some risk indicators for the risk assessment of companies and looking at how they distribute at macro level. So if there are hotspots or areas in the European single market where we can find a concentration of these indicators, and also calculate these indicators in real time through a specifically designed tool that will fit the need of each of these group of public authorities. Also, since together with the beginning of the project, it was also the beginning of the war. Unfortunately, we also added an extra work package, and now we are mapping all European companies linked to sanction entities following the updates of EU packages of sanctions. These are a number of risk indicators that we calculate, risk factors that we look at, and risk indicators that we calculate at company level. These are just some examples, and I don't want to go into details, but just to show you some of the categories of risk indicators that we look at, and they can be applied at the different operational scenarios in which all these public authorities that participate to the project operate. So we look at the ownership. So if a company has an anomalous complexity, for instance, if it has an anomalous number of shareholders separating it to the beneficial owners, opacity. So if there is a high volume of legal arrangements that do not allow to identify the beneficial owners, lack of information on beneficial owners, shareholding patterns with circular schemes, and other risk indicators that also have been briefly mentioned in previous sessions, but also other red flags such as anomalous rotation in board of directors, frequent changes of name, of address, a recent registration, and also anomalies in the characteristics of the owners. So an anomalous age, for instance, an anomalous female presence that may look odd as a risk indicator. And of course, if a company is owned by women, this is not per se a risk factor, of course, but together with other risk indicators, it can be a powerful red flag in some domains, such as the infiltration of organized crime or sanction circumvention. and I will show you a couple of examples. We also look at links with high-risk countries, taking into account secrecy jurisdictions, as in the FATF-Gafi lists, but also we look at local territorial risks. And as an example is in Italy, where we calculate risk score at municipality level that is taken from investigative evidence and summarizes the risk of mafia, Italian organized crime presence at municipality risk. So we are able to link it to the place of birth of beneficial owners or director for having a comprehensive risk assessment. We also look at, of course, compliance lists you can find on the right side, but also financial anomalies. So we have a set of indicators. One, I think, interesting one that we have replicated is one proposed by European financial intelligence units to identify shell companies that are active in VAT frauds, so that have simultaneously some type of financial anomalies, such as low level of fixed assets, for instance, or a low level of financial debts, but also combined with high correlations between costs and revenues, because these firms are not built to make profits. So this is some examples of the risk indicators that we calculate. And as said, we have basically provided a macro analysis of some of these risk indicators, and also a tool that is able to calculate these risk indicators and perform a risk assessment in real time. So here we use data from Moody's, among others, to map 13 million companies, limited companies at EU level, looking at anomalies in their ownership. And these are some results. So we could map some of the countries in which we have highest volumes of links with blacklisted countries. So you can see that in some jurisdictions in Europe, there is a number of companies that have links to risky countries, as included in FATF black and grey list, which is well above the European average. Greece is actually slightly below. So you can be happy about this. And also you can see that in some European countries, there is a high level of connections to legal arrangements such as trust fiduciaries, foundations, funds that do not disclose information on beneficial owners. Again, we looked also at the complexity of ownership. So if there are companies that have anomalously complex ownership structure, and I think one interesting result is that water transport as a sector has the highest volume of anomalously complex companies in Europe. Do these results actually mean something? So today we are talking about sanctions. Do these indicators help us in understanding something about sanctions? The scientific studies that we did say yes. So the companies with anomalous ownership are also way more likely to be targeted by sanctions or also enforcement measures on themselves or on the owners. So again, we can use these indicators to complement what compliance lists cannot tell us. This is another, so a few results from the mapping of sanctioned entities at European level. So we have now mapped until the 6 EU package and all the assets owned by about 1,200 subjects, and we have reached basically a population of nearly 10,000 European companies. But I think the interesting results is this one in the graph. So what about these companies? What characteristics do they have? Again, we see that these companies controlled by sanctioned individuals and entities have a higher complexity and higher exposures towards risk jurisdiction. So again, risks and sanctions, they seem to go together. Evidence on sanctions and risks on the ownership in particular seem to go together. I wanted to show you briefly some examples from using this tool in different operational scenarios, but I don't want to take too much time. I will just show you this one very quickly. So we start. So in this case, we were looking together with the Romanian partners at a company which was having high risk indicators for financials. So it was having some operation that appear to be linked to the ones of a shell company. So by using different data sources, including Moody's, we can map basically all the ownership structures. So not only the identity, but also the location of these owners. And in this specific case, it is interesting because risk indicators can guide the investigation. We can see that some of these individuals that control this supposed shell company are also coming from municipalities in Italy that are at high risk of organized crime infiltration. So we can also then reconstruct the whole network of companies controlled by these individuals, and also see who are the most central nodes. Through analytics, we can basically use network analysis to see, okay, this individual is actually at the center of the scheme, and then you can perform enhanced due diligence on the individuals that appear to be at the center, at the core of the scheme. Using also data, you can reconstruct also more complex network that belong to different countries. So in this case, we start from a Romanian company. We end up looking at different individuals concentrated in this municipality in Italy at very high risk of organized crime infiltration. And again, all these risks then basically guide us in looking at who could be the most central individuals in this network, and then a more traditional somehow check of evidence and compliance list actually tells us that these individuals have been involved in a previous insurance fraud. So again, we can use risk indicators to basically have some kind of orientation guiding us into the assessment of counterparts. This is another case that we extracted from the tool, which is quite interesting, and we discovered it also by collaborating with the Italian Anti-Corruption Authority. So we discovered this wide network of companies all registered at the same address in a municipality in northern Italy, all having these textbook anomalies, such as a complexity of ownership, the presence of opaque corporate vehicles, absence of beneficial owner, connection to high-risk countries, and also directors born or connected somehow to municipalities at high presence of organized crime. And one of the central companies in this network was actually a special purpose vehicle. So a vehicle for securitization, and from open source, we found that basically this SPV was the order of securitization of receivables from a construction company in southern Italy that had been basically involved in a public contract that then had been reported by the Italian Corruption Agency for having several anomalies in management and execution. So this helps us understanding how these risk indicators can provide additional evidence and somehow helping you build the case when you're assessing the risk or any type of counterpart. Why did I show you these cases that maybe are not strictly related to sanctions? Well, because we see similar schemes also in sanction circumvention, use of opaque and complex ownership structure to conceal the identity of beneficial owners, use of female owners, again, to hinder the identification of beneficial owner, which is something that we also see. So there is a common ground in these anomalies. From our research, we demonstrated actually that organized crime group have heavily used female owners as strawmen, as figureheads to conceal their identity. And as you can see here, the presence of female owners in confiscated firms to organized crime groups is way higher than in the rest of Italian companies. So is this the research question is this because organized crime in Italy promotes female entrepreneurship? And unfortunately, the answer is probably no. So yeah, just to conclude on these projects, and then I will bring you briefly another example. So also investigative journalists are using this tool and these indicators in different domains. So you can see how they can be useful. On the one hand, these Italian journalists have used this tool to uncover patterns of infiltration of organized crime in the legal economy in a municipality of Rome after the economic crisis stemming from the COVID-19 crisis, pandemic. And also it has been used by Romanian journalists to reconstruct a network of vessels using flag of convenience that were linked to this Romanian millionaire that was transporting Russian oil during the war, and also using several data were reconstructing all these complex ownership networks and publishing this investigation. So this brings me to the next example, and I will be showing you very quickly some things that we have done in another European project, Promenade, which I wanted to present also because there was an heavy involvement of Greek partners. So as you can see, the Greek Coast Guard, the Ministry of Maritime and Insular Policy, but also CHEMEA, the Research Center on Security Studies, and some industrial players such as Marine Traffic, which is a provider of data for tracking vessels. So there was a big consortium at European level, and the objective was to develop an integrated tool that could be used by a border guard to track vessels and identify risky situations in their operational scenarios, and in particular, seizure of drugs, irregular migration, smuggling, ship-to-ship transfer, and other types of risks. So these are some examples that also have been mentioned in the first presentation of behavioral patterns of vessels and sanction evasions. So after the outburst of the war between Russia and Ukraine, there have been a huge number of ship-to-ship transfer, some of the coast of Greece, and also research by Lloyd's, as highlighted, how previously used vessels, so vessels previously used to transport Iranian or Venezuelan crude have been involved now in shipping Russian oil. And so we ran also some analysis on this, and it is interesting to see that also in these cases we can identify some risk factors that have a predictive power. So all these vessels have been manipulating AIS location signals. They have an opaque ownership structure. They have encountered several name changes, flag changes, and crew changes. So it is possible, once again, to identify recurrent patterns and characteristics to assess whether there is a risk, a specific risk for a vessel. Again, vessels are assets, and often they're owned by companies. So again, it is possible to look at their ownership. And there is, as mentioned by Nicola, an increasing use of shadow tankers that are not officially registered they do not have an IMO number, so a number from the International Maritime Organization, do not have ownership, and they are heavily used manipulating location signals to do ship-to-ship transfers. So these are some highlights from the tool and what type of anomalies we were looking at. So all these different partners were providing services that somehow were able to profile a vessel and to look First of all, its behavior. So if it was likely to be conducting ship-to-ship transfer, or also patera taxi activity. Patera taxi is a small vessel that transports migrants, and it is a particular type of vessel that goes very quickly towards the shore, unloads migrants a few hundred meters from the shore, and then goes back very quickly, thus reducing the likelihood of being caught, but also of course, carrying very high risks for the migrants. We were also looking at the history of movements of vessels, and also, again, their characteristics. So an anomalous rotation of key individuals, frequent changes of name, complexity, opacity of ownership, and so on. Well, I don't want to spend time on the technicalities of the tool, but just to say that we were fusing together a lot of data sources coming from different domains, and basically putting them into a data lake that was used for artificial intelligence algorithms in order to extract relevant information. And again, importance of data, importance of information sources, and also importance of data analytics technique to deal with these different data. Here are some examples from Promenade. So here we look at the history of a vessel, for instance, and we can see basically AIS off incidents, how many times this vessel has basically switched off location signals in the last weeks, how many name changes, how many manager and owner changes, and from these we can identify a high risk. And it was interesting to see that actually this vessel was in the news for being intercepted by Spanish customs for carrying drugs. This is another example on how we basically demonstrated this tool. So we tested this tool in operational scenarios in Greece, in Spain, and in Lithuania. So in this case, we were with the Spanish Coast Guard, which was simulating the movement of these patera taxi. So these quick vessels that approach the shore very quickly and then make a U-turn and come back after unloading the migrants into the sea. And so basically, the Spanish patrol vessel was simulating the movement of this patera taxi, and these artificial intelligence algorithms basically were trained to identify this type of movements. And so you can see that here, since there is a vessel that is approaching the shore quite quickly, we have a medium risk of patera taxi activity. And then the vessel is going to stop a few hundred meters from the coast. And so in this case, we will start having alerts of high risk of patera taxi, because these so here you see very high risks of patera taxi because the artificial intelligence algorithms recognize this pattern as previously, so very similar to previously observed patterns. And this is interesting to see that when also, so the vessel will make a U-turn and we will have an extra alert. So this is how the overabundance of information on vessels can be used to generate intelligence for the Coast Guards. And yeah, these are some quick examples on how, so we could do basically the same activity also for other use cases, such as drug trafficking or ship-to-ship transfer. And then the behavioral anomalies could be complemented by these risk profiles that were looking at the characteristics of vessels. So in this case, the behavioral part tells us that there is a risk of drug trafficking because a vessel has unloaded something, has basically made the stop and unloaded something that was basically then approached by another vessel. So we can see that there is also a risk in the ownership because the vessel is controlled by a trust that does not allow to identify the beneficial owner. And also we can see that there are some adverse events generated for the vessel, And looking into the previous history of the vessel, we see that has been used previously for drug trafficking, and we got a similar result in the case of smuggling. So a behavior analysis of the vessel was highlighting that this vessel was potentially used for smuggling, and we could retrieve this risk profile by looking at the vessel and checking that that actually in the history of activity of the vessel we could find some adverse events, and the vessel was actually used for ship-to-ship transfer of petroleum destined for Syria. So another, I would say, another powerful lesson is that somehow history repeats itself, and it is important also to look at that. To conclude, a few takeaways. I've started highlighting how legitimate companies can be used in any type of illicit scheme, and what are some risk factors that we can identify across different domains to identify connections with potentially illicit activities. Again, schemes are getting more complex, but information is getting richer. It is fundamental to develop knowledge of available data, especially on ownership, but also on general characteristics of companies and related entities, individuals. And it is important also to have some knowledge of data analytic techniques to develop indicators and models that would help us identifying high-risk companies or vessels. So this was my presentation. I don't know if there is any question from the audience. I leave here my name and contacts in case you wish to know more about our activity and research. And again, I'm sorry that I haven't been able to join the event, but I think I hopefully you're gonna have a great evening even without me.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Probably you didn't predict the flight cancellation.
No.
But anyway, things happen. Very comprehensive, your approach. And when I was watching that, I envisioned what the future would look like for us, the compliance officers, that we're struggling now to find these hundreds of connections. And you will offer us these connections easily and on a map, on maps. Okay, easily comprehensive and easily understood. Thank you so much. Strangely enough, we are almost on time. I promise I will take only 5 minutes to put some closing remarks. We heard today about the landscape by Nicholas and the mechanisms that they are around to the various sanction regimes. We heard about implementation programs on organizations. We heard about third-party screening mechanisms, what we need to watch for. The panel shared their experiences and insights from the day-to-day operations, very useful. We heard about the benefits to the need to search for the ultimate beneficial owner and what the benefit is out of it. And we heard about the use of artificial intelligence in our work, and this will be probably the future for us. I wanted to thank the Νομική Βιβλιοθήκη for hosting this event, all of you for attending the event, all the presenters that spent their time to prepare for the event and also to share their experiences. Believe me, we spent more than a month to align and bring this event live. We thank also Moody's for traveling specifically to Athens for this event, and also the remote speakers who were with us. And this event has been, I need to mention that, has been with the collaboration of the AML working group, among others, AML working group of SECASE, of our association. So here I would like to invite you to join our association if you think it will create value to you. We do many interesting stuff. And also to join the working groups of the association, which is AML, whistleblowing. We recently have had some webinars over whistleblowing, and also the legislation updates. Whoever is interested to offer some time over these groups, it will be very beneficial for the persons and for the whole member, for all members. Finally, I wanted to tell you that this is a very complex issue. However, we try to decode it. That's why the title is Decoding Sanctions, Economic Sanctions. We try to make it simple. We try to explain that you can have an approach, an easy approach to a very advanced approach. And the message I want to say as an ending remark is that on this journey, you're not alone. Okay? You will find many other people that are interested. You can ask CKC, the members, the AML team, and we will help each other to excel into this kind of obligation. Thank you very much all for staying that late, and we hope to see you in other events.